So this is the Newfoundland narrow gauge empire. Like I said, it was a 547-mile long main line. So when we have slides that have a lot of text, I'll pipe down. Now here's a picture of a standard gauge freight car on the narrow gauge 42-inch track.
Tom, was that car lifted off its standard gauge trucks and put on narrow gauge trucks, I guess, that you showed?
Yeah, that is correct. At Potomac, which is the southwest corner of the island, the freight cars were unloaded from the hold of a ship from a ferry on standard gauge track, and they were brought into a yard there that had dual gauge track, and then the cars were lifted up and put onto narrow gauge trucks. So in 1970, and of course 1983, when we were there, it was mostly merchandise cars, box cars, gondola cars, tank cars. And by 1984, CN, Canadian National, who owned the railroad, they decided to try and convert everything to container service. In other words, flat cars. And here's a picture of the ferry from Nova Scotia, from North Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Port aux Basques. There was a night ferry and a day ferry. And it was about a 9-hour trip. And most of the time it was uneventful, but in bad weather, it could be rather spectacular. Like you thought you were on the Edmund Fitzgerald. But they never sank a ferry, but we saw pictures displayed in Port aux Basques of a ferry that if you saw the picture, you'd never want to take the ferry again. It was like 45-degree angle in the water. So anyway, North Sydney is in Nova Scotia, the south end, and Port aux Basques is the location on Newfoundland Island on the north end.
Were those ferries steam powered like the CNOs in Lake Michigan?
No, they were all pretty modern. It was called CN Marine, Canadian National Marine. So this is a standard gauge train. This is a standard gauge train in Nova Scotia. This is a train that some of these cars would connect to the ferry to Newfoundland. There was also passenger service to North Sydney until VIA killed that off. And the track is still there, but it doesn't operate. It's pretty much out of service. So here we are at North Sydney, Nova Scotia, on the mainland, where there's the terminal where they load the ferries. You can see there was box cars, piggyback cars, there was container cars on flat cars. That goofy looking herald was the logo for Terra Transport. That was the name of the railroad on Newfoundland. And these pictures were taken in 1984 when they were in the process of trying to convert everything to containerization. And then a few years after that, they just decided to say the hell with it, just abandoned everything and sent everything by truck. So Newfoundland got screwed out of their railroad by CN, and the government of Newfoundland wasn't interested in keeping the railroad or maintaining it themselves. So here we are on the ferry sailing from Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful ride, and the ferry is nice. It has full restaurants on it and everything. And it even has sleeping accommodations for the night trip. It's about a 9-hour trip. And there's another ferry that actually went closer. You can see we were concerned about maintenance on the ship. They had the sign held together by rope. It said CN Marine. That's what those letters were. Here's sailing across the ocean. That's the Atlantic Ocean. And like I said, it was a very pleasant journey. So the Newfoundland Railway had a main line that was 547 miles long, And it also had 4 branch lines. And the Clarenville line, the Placentia line, and the Carbonear subdivision had passenger service, mixed train service, which was just incredible. And what was really the rarest one of all was the Bona Vista subdivision. It was about 90 miles long, and it only ran 1 day a week on a Wednesday. Go figure. So here's a map, and most of your lines that had passenger service were over on the far right on this map. The lower right was your Carbonear line and your Placentia line, and the once a week line to Bona Vista. And they had an employee's timetable. It was a real railroad, and didn't have any signals. It was not a signaled railroad. It was all operators. And many of the stations actually had agent operators, which was kind of amazing that when you figured that there wasn't that much ridership on the branch trains. So Corner Brook was about a third of the way. In 1970, I traveled from Port aux Basques to Corner Brook, that's over on the left-hand side there, by bus. And I invaded their yard in Corner Brook and got a lot of nice pictures. Now here's the southwest end of the railroad at Port aux Basques. That's where the ferry comes in. It's highlighted in yellow over there where it says CN Ferry Terminal. And the line went sort of north and then east. This is a view coming in on the ferry, coming into Port aux Basques. It was in the summer, so we had generally good weather. There's a picture with a ferry in the berth there. In fact, it looks like there's 2 of them in there. One of them carried freight cars. There's, you can see the track there. That's standard gauge track that you're looking at. This is coming in on the passenger ferry. The freight train ferry usually ran at night. So there's a standard gauge yard. Those are all standard gauge cars that have come off the boat. And over on the left, you can see there's some dual gauge track on that left-hand track. And that's a standard gauge switcher. It's a CN, I guess, SW1200. And that was for marshaling the cars around. And that engine there is a narrow gauge, 42-inch gauge Terra Transport or CN EMD switcher. Those were EMDs. You can see dual gauge track there. And that's a narrow gauge or dual gauge caboose. They could move a car from one section to the other just by lifting it up. So most of these cars that you're looking at are the narrow gauge. That's like a reacher car. It's probably the shortest flat car in the world. And it's lettered for Terra Transport, which was a subsidiary of CN. And they had a work train down there. This is at Port aux Basques. And the over-the-road freight, there's dual gauge track. The over-the-road freight ran 7 days a week, which was nice. And it ran approximately on the same schedule every day. There's dual gauge track there coming out of town, but the dual gauge ended right about at this point. You can see the yard down there. There's where we have gone to the single track narrow gauge. The freight left at noon every day. That was the scheduled time for departure. So that was good because you knew when it was going to run. And it wasn't like one of those on again, off again. You never knew when it was going to happen. So here we are taken off out of town. This was in 1984 when most of the traffic was converted to the containers on flat cars. And the road, which is called the Trans-Canada Highway, or TCH, their version of US 1, that pretty much paralleled the railroad. So chasing was pretty easy. And the train, the maximum speed anywhere, I think, was 40 miles an hour. But most of the time, it was a little bit less than that. You also had high winds in certain areas. They had a sign up here. It says you were advised to stop until wind subsides. Well, we couldn't stop because we were chasing a train. And it ran right along the ocean there. Now, this is on the southwest side of Newfoundland. So that's the the portion of the Atlantic Ocean between Newfoundland and like Labrador or New Brunswick. So here we are running alongside the water, just taken from the road. And some of these stations were abandoned, like this one, or closed, but some were still open and had operators in them. But since there was only one train a day, you didn't have to really worry about meets. This was along the way where there was a quarry and they had a bucket line, sort of like they had in the cement district of eastern Pennsylvania until the 1960s, that moved raw materials out to a pier, as you can see on the left there. We just thought this was kind of unique, so we took a break from the chase, knowing that we could catch up to the train pretty easily. So here we are chasing the train. There was just an infinite number of pictures and locations because the road generally followed the track. So it was pretty easy to stay ahead of them. These are different trains on different days. I think this is the one that you saw leaving Port aux Basques. It had that bulkhead flat car in there, second out. Corner Brook was about a third of the way up to on the line, and it was there was a big paper mill there, Bowater Paper. I don't know if that's still there. It's probably gone by now, but at the time, it provided the railroad with a lot of service. There was also a mixed train on the main line from Corner Brook to Bishop's Falls, which was the middle portion of the line. So there were actually 4 separate sections of the line that still had passenger service. That's the bus that I rode in 1970. Prior to, in the 1960s, they had a train that ran the entire length of the railroad called the Newfie Bullet. And that actually had sleeping cars and a dining car and everything. But by the 1970s, everything was buses. That's the paper mill in Corner Brook. It was called Bowater Paper. And some of the product was shipped out by ships, by boats. But they also had stuff that moved by rail, and they had their own critter engine, which of course I managed to get shots of. And what was beautiful too was back in that era and also in that location, you could take pictures and nobody yelled at you or said it was high security or you can't be here. You just enjoyed it. So here's a local switcher in Corner Brook, which was handling deliveries to and from the big paper mill over on the left. And here's their engine terminal at Corner Brook. They had 2 different kinds of diesels on the Terra Transport or CN. They had those end-cab road engines, these things here, they called them G8s. They were 800 horsepower. And then they had some 1,200 horsepower road switchers that looked like Baldwins, but they were in fact EMDs. Anyway, this is still a Corner Brook. And all sorts of ancient equipment.
Wow, truss rods, wow.
Yeah. Another reacher car. Notice they had an awful lot of equipment up there that was built for the narrow gauge, like they had a mechanical reefer there. And some of these boxcars were built intended for the narrow gauge. Most of the equipment that you saw on the road freights were, mainland national equipment. They even had a narrow gauge auto rack car. And even had a 6-wheel truck, the depressed center flat car. So Corner Brook was really a great place for pictures because they had a stock car. They had just about every type of equipment there. It might as well have been a museum. Now, I suppose that when the railroad abandoned, most of the stuff was just trashed. They also had a private narrow gauge business car. They had number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was up at St. John. And these are what the coaches looked like. These were built to narrow gauge standards. They weren't mainline cars on narrow gauge trucks. And they had opening windows and Dutch doors. So it was rail fan heaven. Here's one of your G8s. They were 6-wheel trucks. So they were sort of like an SD9, but they looked more like a GP7. And here's one of the cranes. And there's like a home road work car. I'm glad I took all these roster shots because a lot of times people don't bother. They go only for the action shots, but don't panic. I do have lots of action shots to come. And there is the daily train that came from Bishop's Falls to Corner Brook. It was a freight. It was like a relay, this transcontinental train. The first part that you saw ran to Corner Brook. Then the section ran from Corner Brook to Bishop's Falls, and that had a mixed train passenger car in it that you could ride. And then the third section ran from Bishop's Falls to St. John's. Yeah, the weather on Newfoundland was rather, I would say, mixed. You could go from horrible weather like that to absolutely beautiful blue skies, but you rarely ever had, it's really not that bad. We lightened that shot. That is on the Bona Vista branch, that 89-mile long branch that ran 1 day a week with one car. Now, St. John's is on the northeast side of Newfoundland Island, the other end. And the railroad extended the 547 miles between Port aux Basques and St. John's. And it has a natural harbor, which is actually fairly beautiful. And there's a park there. So you can get some pretty nice pictures. Now, here's a map that shows St. John's over on the right. And then Carbonear is one of the branch lines. And Argentia was one of the other branch lines that had passenger service.
Are Newfoundland and Nova Scotia two separate provinces?
Yes, correct. Newfoundland claims to be part of Labrador or vice versa. They call it Newfoundland and Labrador, but they're physically separated.
Okay.
But Nova Scotia is on the mainland. So the train depot or end of track was at St. John's Depot, and the track is highlighted there. St. John's is a moderately decent sized city. Very, very nice. And that's the harbor. And the Atlantic Ocean is over to the left in this picture. You can see some ships in there in the harbor. And the railroad engine terminal was like right in the center there. That's the entrance to the harbor. You go past that point, that lighthouse, and you're out in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a starkly beautiful landscape. And this is all a park. And just another view with the town over on the right. But like most places in the world, they built a paved high-class highway from one end of the island to the other. So everybody drives, and we're ships by truck. So there really wasn't much traffic for the passenger train or eventually even the freights. So St. John's to Clarenville was a division point. It was 130 miles. And then Clarenville to Bishop's Falls was another one, another division. As you can see, this lists the mixed trains. Now here we are. These engines look like Baldwin's, but they're EMDs. And I think they were 1,200 horsepower. And they actually had some freight. These were actually mixed trains. But some of them were just passenger only. This was the Argentia train. And the reason you could tell it is because it had a baggage car. And what happened there was sort of like on the Algoma Central. They had a lot of cabins. People had cabins and cottages that were out in the middle of nowhere and were only accessible by train. So you had to ride the train to get to your cabin. You couldn't drive to it. It was nowhere near a road. So this was a combined passenger car that was half caboose and half coach. You can see it right here. And the conductor had his quarters in that little area. So here's the baggage car. So these people that had the cabins out in the marshes would bring their canoes and food and supplies, and the train would stop and throw it off to them. This is still in downtown St. John's, the capital. Now, riding the mixed trains, there were two main branches. One went to Carbonear and one went to Argentia, and each of them ran 3 times a week. So Monday through Saturday, there was always a passenger train. They alternated. And you rode on 50 and 80-pound rail, but there were places where you were doing 40 miles an hour, which was really, I would say, exhilarating. And it rode very well. We'll do the Carbonear subdivision first. This actually had some freight traffic on it. Not a lot, but a couple of box cars and a couple of cement cars. And it was great to be riding a mixed train where you'd stop at a customer and the engines would cut off and shove into the customer's siding, pick up or drop a car, and then couple back up to the passenger train, and then you'd take off. So here's the Carbonear branch. It was about almost 40 miles long after it broke off from the main line. So you came out of St. John's and went to Brigus Junction and then diverged onto the branch and went almost another 40 miles to Carbonear.
Do they have any semaphore signaling left?
No, they didn't have any signaling on the railroad at all. I don't think ever. They had operators, and you got clearance to go up the branch and then come back down the branch. So as you can see, it kind of followed the lay of the land. It was very scenic. You got water views, and Carbonear was like a fishing village at the end of the line. And every once in a while you'd stop and somebody would actually get on or off the train. Somebody would actually use it. And it was like, wow, look, a passenger. But it was mostly a rail fan excursion. So here we are getting ready to dig out of St. John's, and he's got two box cars. So this got a baggage car in there, so it's an Argentia train, but he's going to drop those box cars before he gets to the branch line. Same thing here. This is probably a Carbonear train because he's got cement cars, and they're going to a cement plant on the branch. Believe it or not, some of these stations were not abandoned. They actually had agent operators, which was kind of mind-boggling, but that's where they got their train orders. The agent still lived upstairs. There's your only signal. It's a train order signal. Now here, it must have been Rugrat Day on the railroad because a whole bunch of kids got on to ride. And they just boarded right at a grade crossing. And here we are riding along. Notice they had a Caban wood caboose stove over on the left there to keep the cars heated in the wintertime. And here we stopped on the main line. This is taken out of the window of a passenger coach. The engine's cut off and grabbed a bunch of ballast cars out of a quarry. So you just sat there and watched the show. Those engines, by the way, had very small cabs. Here we are right along the edge of the water with a couple of ballast cars in front of us. We're taken out of the end of a coach here, looking forward. Here's coming back on a Argentia run. Sometimes you were down at water level. Sometimes you were up quite high. So the railroad was up and down and around. Here we have a couple of flat cars and some box cars. So they still had freight business on the branches. But they just slowly killed it off and then had an excuse to abandon. But it was just great. It was like another world, not only because it was narrow gauge, but because you're on an island. You were just separated from the rest of the world. And it was a real railroad. It had engines, it had grade crossings, it had passenger cars. Now here you had a baggage car and a hopper. This was a place called Holyrood. There was actually an amusement park near here, and sometimes you'd get passengers on the train that would come out to the amusement park. This is at Holyrood. Different trains, different days. When we were up there, we were there for like a week each time, so we're able to get different. Now here's your Brigus Junction Union Station. This is where the branch diverges to Carbonear from the main line.
Did steam last any longer there than over in mainland Canada?
I don't think so, because they had these engines that you're looking at, and they were from the 50s. Here's where we stopped, and they're drilling out cement cars. at a customer, which had these cars had come over from the mainland. So, and this is on the Carbonear branch. It's just like, it's hard to believe that this could exist. And you kick yourself because we should have gone back. And it was so friendly. The train crews were incredibly friendly. Conductor on the passenger train was always accommodating. Now there's an operator. That guy standing there is an operator at Spaniards Bay. So he would hand up orders to the conductor, say there's no trains ahead. And this is at Holyrood. The train made a big horseshoe curve around the end of a bay. And just everything is so clean up there too. They still used oil markers on the ends of the passenger train. This is at Carbonear. They were switching out a lumber yard there. And that's the end of track in Carbonear on the branch. They had like a 25-minute stop here while they turned around. They ran the train around a Y track to reverse direction. So everybody ran across the street to the convenience store to get something to eat. And there's the crew that we had. Gordy Smith was the conductor. That's the guy third from the left in the brown. That's our conductor. He was just a great guy. If you wanted to get off and take a picture, he'd let you get off if they were stopped, you know. And this is leaving Carbonear, and the ocean is like right there. It's just amazing how they built this. I mean, it looks like somebody's model railroad. It was especially nice when they had the freight, the boxcars, as opposed to just when it all went to that container business. Now the Argentius division, that line was 20 miles long. That was a branch. It was half as long as the Carbonear branch, and it wasn't quite as photogenic because there weren't any parallel roads. It sort of went cross lots over marshes to a ferry terminal at Argentia. There was a ferry that came out of North Sydney, just like the one that went to Port Bosque. There was one that came up here to Argentia, but it only ran like one day a week. But if you didn't want to drive the distance from the 547 miles, if you didn't want to drive all the way from Port Bosque to St. John's, you could take this ferry and then get off at Argentia and drive into the city. So here is an Argentia train. Now, why they ran 3 coaches, I don't know, because they never had that many people on it, but they did. And they had the baggage car. So if you saw the baggage car, you knew it was an Argentia train because they had the supplies for the people in the cottages. You'll see some pictures of that. The scenery was just amazing. This is coming into Holyrood. These branches split off after Holyrood at 2 separate locations. Holyrood was the big horseshoe curve. You always wanted to get that shot. Now that's a Carbonear train because he doesn't have any baggage car. This one is a Argentia train. And like I said, we asked the conductor, "Hey, can we get off here and get a quick shot?" Yeah, don't leave without us. Now at Whitbourne, there was an operator here. There was a yard here which didn't have much in it, but there was a actual paid on-duty operator here, and there was some equipment that they were saving for a museum. The middle car was a dining car, and the last car was a sleeper open-end platform observation car. And these are built for narrow gauge in the original Canadian National Paint Scheme. That was a dining car, a narrow gauge dining car. That was used on the Newfie Bullet, which was a 24-hour train ride. Now, what's interesting, there's your open-ended observation car. The train took 24 hours to get from Port Bosque to St. John's. The bus did it in 12 hours. So it was pretty obvious the train was kind of doomed. Now, this is interesting here, too. They decided to make a pickup, and the FAA, here's the operator at what did I say? This was Whitbourne. he was on duty. He was a real operator, and he had to fill out the paperwork for the train. Now, what was interesting, we'll go back one slide here, if I can get this to work. Hold on. Yeah, when the train came in, we were chasing in the car at this time. And this was an Argentia train, had the two engines on the point, and this. They wanted to make a pickup while the train was moving. Now, this is a live passenger train with a handful of people on there. While the train was moving, they just uncoupled. And of course, the passenger cars go in emergency and stop. They just drift to a stop right here at the station. The engines bailed off and went down to the yard to get some freight cars. It was like, I can't believe they can do that. But they did. They just uncoupled while they're still moving, dump the air on the passenger cars, and just keep right on going. So here was an operator at Whitbourne.
Cradle telephone.
Yeah, an old bell telephone, an old transistor radio. So you could also get cab rides. If you ran up to the head end and say, hey, can we ride? Most of Canada, that was true. But particularly on the island. I mean, who's going to give you a hard time? What I did find, though, that the cabs of those, what we called the Baldwins, but they're EMDs, the cabs are extremely tight, very small. So they were actually laying ballast on the main line. They were actually working on the railroad, even though they were going to abandon in a few years. Now, here's Gordy Smith in his caboose section of the passenger coach. And he would cook himself lunch on a stove, on one of those caban stoves. And one time he offered us to share some of his lunch. He was cooking fish that he caught the day before. Now, this is heading down the Argentia branch to Argentia. As you can see, it's kind of rural. And there's those shacks and cabins that are out in the middle of nowhere. There's no road here. And these people would come up to the track and they would set off supplies for them. They were basically weekend warriors. And there's Uncle Tom's cabin, by the way. Absolutely in the middle of nowhere, not near a road. And the people would come out from the city, ride the train out and spend a day or two and then go back. As you can see, it was pretty rural. And what was unique about this line is it actually cut to a United States Air Force base, an Air Force base. We had to stop, open the gate, and go through, and then close the gate on either end. And it was a U.S. Air Force base in Canada. So the conductor had to get off and open the gate and open and close it. And then
Is that one of the bases used to ferry the B-17s over to England? You know?
It might be. Yeah, it might be. It was called Argentia. I don't know if that was the name of the base though. But anyway, now this is the third branch line with passenger service from Clarenville to Bishop's Falls was almost 90 miles. And I mean, from Clarenville to, what's the name of it? Some of these town names escape me. This is the main line to Bishop Falls. Bona Vista, that was the northern end of the branch. So the main line is in the lower left, squiggles around where it says St. John's Sub, and goes off to the left. That's the main line. And the track going up to the right, to the top, that's the branch line with 50-pound rail. And it went up to a place called Bona Vista. And it only ran one day a week, only on Wednesdays, year-round. Freight service was light. There was only a couple of boxcars here and there. So passenger service was also very light. Like we were the only ones on. And we went in the station. The station at Clarenville was open, and we went in and bought tickets. And the crew was very friendly. And same thing, when they stopped, they let us get off and take pictures. So try doing that on Amtrak. But here's your Shoal Harbor was just outside of Clarenville, where the branch diverged from the main line. And the speed limit on the branch was 15 miles an hour. So obviously we weren't, breaking any speed records. So here was our train for the day. We had two of the road switchers, a real boxcar, and a passenger car. So they were going to set that boxcar off. I think at Princeton is where they set it off. So there was your crew base and operator at Clarenville there. It was a crew change point for the mainline trains. And these were our road switcher engines. So here, conductor is lining the switch to go off the main line and get onto the branch, the Bona Vista branch. And here's Lethbridge. Now that's an operator there, a conductor talking to the operator. It was hard to believe. You're in the middle of nowhere, this weather-beaten station, and there's a paid employee there. So here's where they set out that boxcar. It was a customer that had a team track and was going to unload. I don't know what was in it. I suspect it was probably lumber or something like that. Here they are setting it off and picking it up 2 different days.
They didn't allow paint in the budget for those stations, right?
Well, I guess they had a kind of foreboding doom that they knew that they were going to abandon. They were trying to abolish the agents and they were killing off the freight business. You know, it was CN. There's the boxcar that you saw earlier in the show at Lethbridge there. And you can see the difference between the narrow gauge trucks and normal trucks. And like here, they made the station stops. They actually stopped. Well, because there was an operator there. So we always said, hey, can we get off, run around, take a picture? And we had to explain to them that we got to run all the way around the other side of the train to get on the right side of the sun. So you got to give us a couple of minutes. And they did. So some of these were a chase with a car, and some of these were taken as we were riding. There were 3 of us. So sometimes we'd split up. One person would drive and chase, and the other 2 would ride, or vice versa. It was just so backwoods and so tank town. They also had something called the Trinity Loop. It was like sort of like Tehachapi Loop, but on a smaller scale and narrow gauge. The train went over itself, and then it circumnavigated a lake and then went under itself. So there's riding over the other track. The track runs around that lake that you can see there. We're going to go downhill, turn to the right, and then come under ourselves there like that. And we knew we had to get that picture. So we should have had them stop, but there was really nowhere to stop up on the top. There was nowhere to stand. It was in the era before drones. This was taken out of the rear of the coach. So it was a black and white picture that we colorized. Now this was at Port Rexton. It was always a nice angle there. I mean, it was the quintessential fishing village with fishing boats all over the place. And just in case you wondered who the Waste Disposal Committee is, they were welcoming you.
They look like lobster traps there on that pier.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. And this was at Trinity Junction. There was a Y track here, and it went off into the town of Trinity. The passenger train didn't go down there, and I don't think too much freight went down there either. But there were just so many photo locations. Notice there's no telephone pole wires in the way, or junk, or high tension towers, or cell phone towers. It was just, look at the track. You would wonder that anything could run over that. And there's a train with passengers in it, or passenger. Here he is coming back on a different day. And everywhere you look, there's always a little boat somewhere. This is on the same line. Look at the hip roof on that house. Some of the houses were really well maintained, as long as they weren't railroad structures. And as you can see, the road roughly paralleled the track, which was great because then you could follow the train. And here's a grade crossing. Notice no flashers, no gates, no FRA, anything. It's just a crossing. You know, there wasn't much car traffic either, so you didn't have to worry about too many wrecks. Notice the crossbucks say railway crossing in Canada, not railroad crossing. There was also a fish processing plant up here. Here, I think this was it. And they had a spur that went out onto a pier where boats would come and they could put fish into one of those mechanical reefer cars that you saw before. And this is on the way back from Bona Vista on the branch. Everywhere you went, every photo was just so amazing. And this is arriving back in Clarenville. Well, you're going to ask, why aren't there any pictures at Bona Vista? For unknown reasons, when we got up there, it was so foggy, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So there wasn't anything to take pictures of. There was a station there. Now, the section from Corner Brook to Bishop Falls, that had passenger service on it. And once again, the reason that had, it was a mixed coach, a coach and a regular freight. But this time, the mixed train or the coach was in a time freight. In other words, a 75 car train, not just a little branch train with one or two cars. And the reason for that was, like the Argentia line, there were houses and cabins that were absolutely in the middle of nowhere in the boonies. And this was how people had access to their vacation cabins. And they would stop on signal anywhere. So we rode the train from Bishop's Falls to Corner Brook. Here's Bishop's Falls. It was a crew change point and a layover. You can see the building there. And there was operators on duty and everything. And there was a yard switcher and an engine terminal. So this is where the road freight came through. So a train coming out of St. John's that got to Bishop's Falls would add a passenger car here, and then they would drop the passenger car at Corner Brook. But you could ride that. You could buy a ticket. It was like $3.80. There's our train. But that's not the whole train. That's just getting us ready. You could buy a ticket. It was like $3 or $8. It was just ridiculously cheap, and it was a several-hour trip. So here they coupled that onto the train. The yard switcher put us all together, and notice the oil marker lamps there, and off we are. And it was funny because you're riding a 75 car train and you're on the rear, and every once in a while the slack would run in and boom. They asked you to be careful when you're walking around. And we were followed by a high rail car, and that's the countryside we went through. As you can see, we are in the middle of nowhere near a road. The Canadian highway, the TCH, was about 50 or 60 miles north of here. And that's our train. It's not uncoupled. Those are flat cars in there on the right. But we had like 4 units, and we were whipping along doing like 40 miles an hour. Even while we were there, we knew this was like something special. We recognized it. Here's lumberjacks and fishermen. There was a lot of logs in the water, mostly to service that Bowater paper plant that we talked about before. And here we are with another shot of that train that we rode. Again, some of us chased, some of us rode. So there's a mixture of pictures here. And we also chased the road train. Here's a different day with 3 units out on the main line. And it was an easy chase. From Bishop Falls to St. John, it was chaseable by road. The road was nearby, and you could get good shots like this. And there's the whole train in one shot. And this was almost toward the end when they were trying to get rid of the boxcar and merchandise type service and just have containers. And they went through all the trouble of building container terminals at all the major stops like Corner Brook and Bishop Falls and St. John's. And they went through all the expense of setting up for containers and everything. And then they just abandoned everything. After they went and did that, they just said, "Ah, the hell with it," and got rid of it. And it's said that the government didn't have any interest in preserving it as a railroad. But I guess it's the old story. Trucks would get it there in 8 hours, and the train would take a day and a half or 2 days. So, but the scenic possibilities were just amazing. And the economy up there is primarily fishing. And there's not a lot of manufacturing. There aren't a lot of mines or anything, or quarries or anything like that. So that's pretty much it. It's gone forever. And those are some of the people that I went with and railfanned with when I was up there. And it was just a joy to do. I mean, railfanning is fun, but this was just really something special. That's it. And then there was articles in Railpace Magazine back in the 1980s about this, last runs of the Newfie mixed. And that was the saddest picture of all. It wasn't enough to just donate a passenger car to some museum or something. They had to burn it and destroy it. And that's the end. So thank you for your time. and for watching it. If there's any questions, I don't know if you guys have a question and answer section at the end, but if you do, you're welcome to chime in.
Tom?
Yeah.
Bill Kalkman here. Is the track still in place, or has it all been lifted and turned into like bike trails?
I think it's all been lifted and just turned into abandoned. There may be some sections that are bike trails, but obviously most of that 547-mile main line wouldn't be a bike trail. There's nobody out there.
Yes. So no rail in place anywhere.
I don't think so. And there's and unfortunately, there's no tourist line or anything. It was really pretty stupid. Even if they didn't keep the entire end-to-end length of the railroad, you would figure that they could have kept something out of St. John's, which is a city and a tourist area, and it was so spectacularly beautiful. They could have kept the line to Carbonear, for example. That was scenic and something that they could have had a dinner train or a scenic train of some kind, but just weren't any rail fans or people up there that cared about it.
The narrow gauge was an odd one.
42-inch gauge is called Cape gauge, and it's actually a fairly common in areas that were developed by the British. Japan is 42, New Zealand is 42.
Australia
has 3 gauges. They have English standard gauge, and they have broad gauge, and then they have narrow gauge, the 42.
Yeah.
So it's important that rail fans who are older, who have slides, think about digitizing their collections as quickly as they can. First of all, because the slides tend to fade and turn colors over the years, especially if you shot Ektachrome or GAF film or some other junk. Ansco, yeah. Or the fact that we may not be around forever. So you also might want to think about what you want to do with your collection, willing it to like an NRHS chapter, or like the Center for Railroad Photography and Art that's out in Illinois, or the Anthracite Railroad Historical Society. They accept collections so that your good work will live on. So,
hey,
yeah.
I get the feeling from your program that life in those two provinces is much slower paced and informal.
It was. Everybody was friendly. Everybody was nice. You never had anybody, like if you were standing on somebody's front lawn or something, nobody would come running out with their Doberman. What are you doing on my property? I'm going to release the dog, and there weren't any ghettos in Newfoundland at all. There were a lot of people there that you could tell didn't make a lot of money. It was a fishing economy. There wasn't much agriculture. I don't remember ever seeing a farm anywhere. I guess the soil wasn't that conducive to it. But and summers were short. Like if it went up to 80 degrees, it was a heat wave. But and it was a little bit like Binghamton, New York. You didn't get beautiful blue skies all the time. You counted sunshine in minutes sometimes and hours some days. But you worked at it, and I'm forever grateful that I did it. But like when I went out and did the Milwaukee Road in the 1970s, you never knew then that I should just quit my job and move out here and do this for 6 months. You just figured, we'll have to get back in a year or two. And then you read in Trains Magazine that it shut down. It's like, oh, damn. You didn't, there was no Railfan grapevine then. You didn't have a Railpace Magazine. You didn't have Facebook. You didn't have people that were all online that would tell you what was going on. And that was part of the problem, just getting information. And in the early 1970s, I joined Tri-State Chapter, NRHS up in Dover. And some of the guys who were in the chapter worked for the railroad, for Erie Lackawanna. So then it was good because they'd come out and say, oh, there was a big wreck yesterday out at Lordville, New York. And they're detouring trains over the Lackawanna. And it's like, oh, wow, cool. I got to go out and see that. But other than that, there was no way of finding out stuff about that like that. So,
hey, Tom.
Yeah.
In the 2024 Canadian Trackside Guide on section 3, pages 125 to 127, there's a list. There's quite a few pieces of rolling stock have been saved in Newfoundland. It says all preserved items listed for Newfoundland are 42-inch gauge.
Mm-hmm.
And there's quite a few pieces of rolling stock, places like Bishop's Falls, Bonavista, Carbonear, Clarenville, so I don't see any any engines, but a lot of cabooses, baggage express, diners, sleepers, snow plows, all kind of
Yeah.
stuff has been saved in Newfoundland.
Yeah, the heartbreak is that there's no track. If they had only had, if the nitwits had only saved some track where they could have some operation, like if they'd saved the Carboneer branch or something, they could have a tourist train. But again, how many tourists go to Newfoundland? And
Yeah.
you know,
Well, at least there's quite a bit of pieces must be on display in those places.
probably a lot of that stuff was probably sponsored by guys who worked for the railroad at the time, who wanted to save a caboose or a passenger car. When we were up there, I don't recall ever seeing another rail fan. In other words, even from England or United States or other parts of Canada, running around taking pictures. And even though the railroad was somewhat part of people's lives, it ran through their towns, but people didn't commute on the train. There was no long distance train. There was the branch trains. Remember that one passenger train we rode, that the one Carboneer train we rode, a whole bunch of kids got on at one of the stations. I don't know whether that was a school thing or what. It looked like it had to be organized because it was like 12 or 15 kids. Maybe it was a school group or something, or a camp group or something. But other than that, you didn't see like people standing at a grade crossing waving at trains or pointing a camera at a train. It was different than down here.
Yeah,
But
I've
it
seen
was-
quite a few pictures by Joe McMillan and Steve Patterson. I guess they were up there at some particular point. I don't know if Joe did a book on it or where. I remember
Yeah,
seeing
I
those
don't
pictures,
know if
but I
there's
know
any-
I've seen them.
I don't know if there's any books on it, and there should be, because it was so substantial. It wasn't just, a short line or anything. It was unique in that it was narrow gauge. It was unique in that it had these branch trains with passenger service. Like I said, the Newfie billet quit in the late 60s, but the branch trains lasted till like 1984. So that was like another 15 years.
Tom, this is
Yeah.
John. I'm just going to say, did you want to come on camera for a minute so we can thank you face to face? All
There you
right.
are. Well, I
Well-
got a haircut today, so I look a little better than I did yesterday.
Well, how about everybody? How about if we give Tom a nice hand for that great show? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thanks for coming.